9th meeting of the Economy Committee. Some members will be attending this morning's meeting via Starleaf, and our witnesses will be briefing us via Starleaf. The meeting will be broadcast live when open to the public, and a recording will be made available on the committee's webpage on the Assembly website. Just to remind members that any bill briefings will be Hansarded as per protocol, and to ask members to mute their tablet devices when they're not speaking. So moving on then to item number 1, which is apologies.
None received. Mr Dunn's going to be slightly late, and Miss Sugden and Mr O'Toole will be joining us online.
Okay, thank you. So moving on then to item number 2, which is our draft minutes. There's a copy of the draft minutes from the meeting on the 2nd of February at page 5. Are members content that those are an accurate reflection of the meeting?
Content.
Okay, thank you. And then moving on to item number 3, which is Chair's business. So members will be aware that the onshore fracking prohibition bill passed second stage yesterday evening, and it has now been referred to committee for our scrutiny. Obviously there's a 30-day limit on the committee stage, which runs until the 23rd of March. That is our final scheduled meeting of the committee, and as discussed at last week's meeting, due to the limited time that we have left in this mandate and the committee's current legislative workload, it's important that obviously I highlight to the committee that we will be unable to give this bill the appropriate attention and scrutiny that it deserves and requires. We will seek to hear from the bill's sponsor to brief members on the bill's schedule and issues permitting, and I think we will also seek to get some written evidence.
Chair, so our survey has gone out, no, sorry, it hasn't gone out. What am I saying? We're preparing our survey. I'm one bill behind. I know it went out. So we will do that, but I am a bit worried about the length of time we'll have on that. We've already had some pushback about this one, but I think it's a template. We can put it out there on Citizen Space, and if it's really not getting much of a response, we can set it aside. But I do think if we're looking at the bill, it's part of our process. We have to do it. We'll do a targeted call for evidence as well, in terms of specific stakeholder groups that we would want to hear from. Because we've already done a little bit of work on this before, we know the concerns of particular groups in specific areas. What we're trying to now do is see if we can hunt down some academics who can give us the sort of factual basis and background of what exactly fracking is, does, and so on. So we'll try and get as much of that done as possible. And the idea is we push out some evidence, but it won't be startling, sparkling, or conclusive. Well, it'll potentially be conclusive, and we wait and see what the evidence is. But again, it's going to be really, really heavily caveated with the fact this was very, very fast. But we'll try and do as much as we can with it. As I say, what we'll maybe do is seek the approval of the groups we've spoken to before to carry over papers that we've had from them. We have a fair amount of papers on this, and that'll save us a little bit of time. And then if we get some academics in as well.
Yeah, so the Minister indicated in his response to the debate yesterday evening that he was publishing the Hatch report. So obviously that will offer some evidential basis across a number of areas, you would imagine.
That might well make our job a little bit easier, because it'll have all that evidence. It'll have conclusions, and then the department's kind of response to that will give us a clearer picture of what exactly their intentions are. So that again is going to be, once we've seen that, we'll probably reassess, but as soon as we have our hands on that, we'll bring it to committee, and we'll have this conversation again just to see where we are. But at the minute, we're going into process for our survey, our call for evidence, etc., as we would always do. So we'd hope to have that with a fair wind behind us to committee, probably table back next week.
Okay.
I'm saying that out loud, hoping.
So does that mean in our last meeting on the 23rd of March we hopefully agree a report, committee report?
Ideally, I'd like to do it before that, because we have our legacy report to agree that day, and various other bits and pieces we need to do. So we may find a creative way to hear from whom we need to hear from, but I think no matter what we do, this is the caveat that this is not the job we would normally do. But look, here is what we found out. Here's what people are saying. Here's the evidence we have, and we're pretty much going to be doing that with anything from now on. It's all going to be curtailed, especially when there's no opportunity on this one to extend. Technically there is, but it just would be a bit meaning. We'll see how well we can get through that.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you, Peter. So moving on then, also just to highlight that the clerk circulated correspondence this morning from the department in relation to the granting of 2 mineral prospecting licences. So that is for members to note.
Chair, it's maybe worth reflecting on the fact that the department has indicated that consultation turned up a lot of misunderstanding, and it might just be worth highlighting that there is no ability to grant licences for prospecting for gold and silver. That's a Crown Estate issue. So the names of companies may be a little bit misleading. So we don't have specifics around what exactly the prospecting is about, but it's minerals. So it's safe to say it's whatever we have here, we don't have a lot of very exotic or exciting things. But it's not gold and it's not silver. And these are just prospecting licenses. These are just prospecting licenses, so literally there is no ability to go beyond prospecting. So there's no extraction, there is no mining carried with these licenses. That's a full other regime. So it's maybe just worth stressing the fact that this is simply prospecting. I have no technical knowledge of what that looks like. I'm still picturing people with sieve things in a stream, but I'm sure that's probably not right. But
well, I wonder what actually what does prospecting mean? How far can you? What is it? Can you dig out the side of a mountain and say that's prospecting?
We maybe would be useful if we got detail on what that actually means. The department's information does seem to suggest it's a very light touch thing, but specifics would be useful. We'll have a look and see what we can find out on that. Sure, it might be worth actually taking an expert opinion on that.
Chair, just to pick up John's point, I mean, is there a legal definition of what prospecting actually is, or is it something that's it's maybe a slightly more loose term in terms of the way it's used?
And my understanding is people apply for mineral prospecting licences alongside their Crown Estate application.
Okay.
So,
And Chair, is this part of the global advertising that the Department of the Economy undertook to seek for prospecting across in Northern Ireland? Is that how these licences came about?
These are long-standing. These are renewals.
I appreciate the companies are long-standing, but nevertheless, the Department did put a global call out.
Okay, we'll check on that one as well, Chair, because it's something we haven't had information on. But we'll get a definition and we'll find out what exactly else is going on in the terms of who's looking to prospect. We'll bring that back as soon as we can.
There is a consultation open at
Yes.
the minute on 2 other renewals.
Chair, just looking at the letter, covers an area up to 250 square kilometres. That's not a small area, is it?
It's not, and I think once we've found out what prospecting actually means, it might put that in more context.
Yeah.
These licenses last a fair amount of time, so I don't know, again, because we haven't got the pin down in prospecting, just exactly how intensive or labour heavy that is, but we'll seek a lot more information, because it is something we've never really dealt with before.
Okay, so moving on then to item number 4, which is the Employment 0 Hours Workers and Bandit Weekly and Working Hours Bill, and our briefing this morning from Retail NI and Hospitality Ulster. There's a clerk's memo at page 15 of our packs. There is correspondence from the Women's Resource and Development Agency regarding concerns around the time frame for evidence on the bill at page 17 of our packs. We can come back to that at the end.
We're hoping to bring them in. Sure, we're trying to organise a briefing on that now.
And there's a written submission then on the bill by the Women's Policy Group at page 20. So if members are content, we will include those submissions in the committee's bill report, but we can come back to that at the end of this briefing as well. So can I welcome to the meeting this morning Glyn Roberts, who's the Chief Executive of Retail NI, and Joel Neal, who's Operations Director at Hospitality Ulster. Can you hear us all okay?
I can indeed, Chair.
Yes, Chair, good morning.
Hi, so if I hand over to yourselves, first of all, to make an opening statement, and then we can open it up to members for questions.
Sorry, Chair, is that myself or Glenn?
Whichever of you want to go first.
Glenn, I'll do the honours then.
Go ahead, Joel.
Joel, we don't have camera for you. Is there a problem with the camera?
No, I give camera permission whenever I logged on. Apologies for that.
Just we don't see you.
My laptop currently says this page is accessing your camera and microphone, so
Right.
apologies. I hope it's okay. Look, I'll spare you having a look at me this morning, and I'll batter on if that's okay.
Because we can hear you, so we
Chair,
can start to pick it up. It's fine. It's fine.
Yep, go ahead.
no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Look, a bit of background. I'm sure I don't need to tell you too much about Hospitality Ulster. I think we have engaged with probably everyone in the room extensively, but formed in 1872, Hospitality Ulster is the representative body for pubs, bars, restaurants, accommodation providers and visitor attractions in Northern Ireland, providing representation at every level of government and local authority, supporting the needs of the industry and driving the development of the industry as a career of choice. In fact, alongside Minister Lyons, we have just released the Hospitality Employers Charter over the past week, demonstrating that our businesses are committed to staff training and development as the sector begins the long process of rebuilding post-pandemic. And we're obviously inviting our membership to sign the charter and commit to its points. I'll not go too deep on the charter, but essentially it covers three main points. Firstly, employment rights, employment policies and procedures which are put in place and regularly reviewed by the business, contracts of employment, statements of main terms and conditions which are provided to all employees whenever they start, health and safety, which provide a safe working environment and all necessary personal protective equipment. Secondly, staff welfare, things like breaks, things like employee well-being schemes, work-life balance, equality, dignity and respect in the workplace. And thirdly, development and reward. So we're talking about things like fast-track development and reward programs with pay increments, recognising increased skills and performance. Already paid staff must be paid for all hours worked. Salaried staff must have a set maximum number of working hours. Tips received must be passed on to the appropriate staff, taking account of any collective staff agreements and taxes the employer is legally required to deduct. So that is now in place, and we're inviting signatories from the membership onto that. We very much hope that it will get widespread support. I'd be happy to share a copy with the committee after today. But look, put simply, members and chair, we want to create careers in hospitality. We want to put in place a means of fast-tracking talent into senior positions. We are also on the verge, as I mentioned briefly there, of releasing a brand new employee welfare package to the membership for this upcoming year. So with that said, with regard to the bill itself, there is a place for flexible working in our industry as long as it isn't abused. Hospitality Ulster supports the building of better mechanisms to ensure that it isn't abused. Point 4 of the bill's explanatory says that zero-hour contracts may provide a short-term solution for businesses to respond to changing market conditions and may also be attractive to workers seeking flexibility to balance other commitments. However, their use as a longer-term solution creates uncertainty in terms of lack of guaranteed regular work or earnings and their employment rights. To put it simply, couldn't agree more. The key word here is flexibility, and that's for the employee and the employer. For the employee, workers may be looking for short-term, part-time work which suits their lifestyle. You know, they may be seeking to supplement their income. They may be students who are only home for Christmas or holidays. The zero-hour rota model does actually suit a section of the workforce in the stage of life that they're at. People actively seek out the hospitality industry for that flexibility. Some are looking for as little as 1 day per week to supplement their income. The benefit of this type of contract in hospitality is the ability to choose the hours that suit you as an employee. And to flip the coin for the employer, think of a small independent pub, your kind of traditional one-man band, of which there are many around Northern Ireland, who maybe needs some help with a birthday party or the occasional function. If the ability to retain zero-hour workers is removed entirely, they have to look at then acquiring through an agency. Not only will this cost the business more in an era where obviously margins are squeezed as thin as they've ever been and costs are higher than they've ever been, it will also remove that relationship between the employer and the employee. So often these relationships lead to an employer spotting talent, promoting, offering a full-time job if that's something that suits the employee as they move on through their own experience and career. And members, I'll stress again that this is not for everyone, but it is for some. If it's for a short-term solution which benefits the employer and employee, Hospitality Ulster is, I say again, totally against this being abused, but it still very much has its place in the modern industry. The hospitality industry continues to change, especially after the last 2 years. I think a lot of the issues, a lot of the things that we were up against pre-pandemic have just been kind of magnified and put on fast forward. It's increasingly reliant on functions, on occasions. It is now seasonal. For many, it isn't a 7-day per week job. For others, it is a career of choice and a field in which they can excel, and we very much want to be there to help them excel because it benefits everyone. It's important, as far as we're concerned, to recognise the needs and support both. And I hope I didn't go on too long there, Chair, members. Happy to take any questions or try to expand.
Thanks for that, Joel. Glenn, if I hand over to yourself, and then we can bring members in for questions to you both, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, Chair. And I think it's obviously, given the time scale that your committee said, it was very difficult for us to do an extensive deep dive. And obviously, the comments that we can make are fairly broad. But I think, nevertheless, I hope we can make some important contributions to this. I had a good chat with Gemma yesterday on her private members bill, and obviously understand that it is very unlikely to be through in this mandate and will obviously be revisited in the next mandate. And also our colleagues in Usdor, the Shop Workers Union, who we have an excellent relationship. We work together on a whole range of initiatives, from Sunday trading right through to the dreadful verbal and physical abuse that retail staff suffered during the height of the pandemic. I think it is very important to point out that we're also the first business group to launch a comprehensive wellbeing plan for our members and their staff. And Sharon, thank you for your time at the launch in December. So we take this issue very seriously about workers' rights and looking after retail staff. And of course, looking at the whole issue of zero-hour contracts, it was a commitment in New Decade, New Approach, to ban 0 hours. And putting it in further context, the ONS survey in 2019 showed that Northern Ireland had the lowest percentage of 0-hour contract workers in the UK, that only 1.3% of workers across the whole economy in 2019. That's obviously the lowest in the UK by some margin. And talking to some of our members, obviously, again, there's a bit of a health warning here because we literally didn't have time to do anything too extensive in this. Certainly, some surveys that we've come across with our members that shows that 20% of staff would like to work more hours and 19% would like to work fewer. The issue of banded hours in the private members bill are more or less normal practice now for a lot of our members, whether it's 10 hours or 16 hours for part-time staff. And I literally have not come across a single member, and again, I stand to be corrected in this, that uses 0 hours contracts. It is and has become, to some degree in the retail sector, a bit of an anachronism. It was probably on its own way out during or before the pandemic. I think more or less has had its day as we begin to put the pandemic in the rearview mirror. And Joel referenced the issue of flexibility, both for workers and employers. And throughout the pandemic, we particularly looking at the situation smaller independent retailers found themselves in when they obviously had staff that either tested positive, kids being off school, and the schools being closed. And let's not forget that the majority of our members are essential retailers that were open throughout the last 2 years. and had huge challenges with childcare and other issues when the schools were closed, and obviously not less their own health as well. So, in many respects, when we begin to look at the long list of heroes during the pandemic, certainly our retail staff that were there putting their own health at risk to make sure we all had food and other important products, particularly those in small, rural-based independent retailers who went the extra mile for many vulnerable and older people. I think that looking forward, and very much the bill, I think, is very much is based on this. I think it is about ensuring what is the best way to get that lock in, that flexibility that works for employers, that works for staff. And particularly, obviously, when we look at many of those part-time staff, they tend to be students or single parents or people who have caring responsibilities. And I think the dynamic with smaller business independent retailers is that, because, you're working directly with the boss, the owner manager, so to speak, at times that flexibility is always there because there's much more, I think, of ownership and attachment within a smaller independent retailer than probably you would see in a large supermarket. And I think that, we've seen a lot of that flexibility, good practice throughout the pandemic. We've always believed that the social partnership approach is the right way. We have, as I said, we have good relation with Usdaw. I think when I talked to Usdaw, they confirmed our view that 0 hours are more or less gone within the retail sector. Now, again, we can't wholly stand over that, but I think one of the points that may want to be looked at is obviously with the minimum hours contract, many retail staff, many of them are going way beyond that 10 hours or 16 hours because obviously with the sheer numbers of retail staff that had to isolate, and that was very much the case during, I think, late December, early, and certainly well into January, and still obviously is an issue at the minute. I think that one of the things is how do we, make sure that if a staff member does go way beyond their 16 hours, that reflected perhaps in their terms, conditions, things like sick leave and so on. So I think there is a bit of work to do, and it's worth pointing out that unless I'm too much mistaken, the Assembly is the only devolved administration that has power over employment law, and it might be perhaps useful in the next Assembly term and perhaps the next programme of government that we again look at that. How do we provide that and lock in that flexibility? Works for the small independent retailer, the small businesses of Northern Ireland, and also for their staff. And let's be very clear, with labour shortages as well, really good retail staff are not, I'm saying they're like hen's teeth, but they're worth their weight in gold because, and they want to, many of our members want to hold on to those staff and we'll be to hold on to them. So I think that in conclusion, I think that, very much this bill raises some broader issues in terms of employment law, working conditions, and I perhaps hope that when it does come back, that it probably is updated to reflect the reality of what we all went through in the pandemic and this changed world that we find ourselves in 2022. This is a fundamentally different economy and will be a very different high street and retail sector that we find ourselves in. And I hope that perhaps when we come back with a new administration, sooner rather than later after the election, that we begin to look at all of these issues. Chair.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful from both of you in respect of the bill and I guess the experience of both sectors as well. And I suppose just to refer to the bill and our understanding of what it would require is for employers to offer an employee a banded hour contract after a period of 3 months service. So there's no, as we understand it, obligation on a worker to accept that. So I guess to some extent that the flexibility that we're talking about is provided for in some respects. So I just wonder maybe if you had any view on that aspect of it specifically.
Well, I think that certainly most part-time workers have that sort of baseline of 10 or maybe 16 hours. Many of them actually want, a lot less. And I think it is about, and I think very much it's not, I think the 0 hour contract thing has moved on now. It is getting, how do we support and get that flexibility in for part-time workers, who they need that flexibility and adaptability. So I very much, whilst I think the bill makes very good points, but the banded hours pretty much now is the sort of standard practice, particularly amongst our members, where workers, and indeed, I think the big challenge is not too few hours for many of these part-time workers, because the pressures that are on independent retailers, they want them to work more hours, and sometimes for many workers, and look at the where we are with the cost of living crisis, and very much workers do want to have part-time workers want to do more hours, and our members will always try and facilitate that. But we've also got to balance out that many of these part-time workers have caring responsibilities. They have they could be single parents, they could be studying. So it's all about how do we get a flexible approach that works for the worker and also works for the business. And quite often that practice has been done where the independent retailer is sitting down talking to their staff member and vice versa and saying, like, how can we work this out? And I think that throughout the pandemic, both workers and our members have been stretching themselves to make that work.
Yeah, Chair, if I just follow on from Glenn there, it's really thinking back to, and just as a side note, obviously the timescales here meant that we were unfortunately unable to sort of survey the industry and gather those views. The concern would be for the sort of smaller independent pub, for example, and that, people often think of the hospitality industry as the bigger outlets in Belfast, the sort of multi-outlet operators. The vast majority of our industry are those small community hubs. So it's really the concern possibly, as I say, I would like to speak to the membership on this and gauge their views, but the concern possibly would obviously be in that the industry now is seasonal, that there isn't kind of guaranteed levels of work in terms of the functions that come in terms of the events that may or may not be happening. So there would probably be a concern about, having staff on the books with banded hour contracts and having no real work for them. Obviously set against the fact that our businesses are struggling financially at the moment. They're trying to recover from being essentially decimated for a couple of years. So again, just being able to offer that flexibility to the employer as well as the employee, and that they don't have to put staff on for a set number of hours per week whenever there's possibly absolutely nothing going on, which would obviously be really bad for their costs. I think it's probably something that needs explored further and something that we would need to consult the industry and that specific business type on.
Okay, no, that's helpful, and I guess in the bill itself there are some exceptions, so we can come back and just look at that in more detail. I know it was raised in the second stage debate as well. And I suppose the other thing that the bill does is bans exclusivity clauses. So just to get a view from yourselves about the prevalence of those in both of your sectors, is that something that is still widely used or less so?
Glenn, sorry if I jump in there. It's not something that I think is widespread, to be honest. Again, unfortunately, I don't have statistics for that. I would be interested to find out how many of the 0 hour workers in hospitality, which are again a fraction of the workforce in hospitality, how many of those have exclusivity clauses. But I personally, I don't see that as being particularly helpful to the worker, to the employee. The groundwork that I sort of laid in terms of the place for 0 hour contracts, it's very much based on the employee's stage at life that they're at, what the employees look or supplementary income. The personal friends I have who would be on 0-hour contracts and the people that I know within the industry, quite often they have, a main business elsewhere. I mean, they maybe are setting up a business themselves or they're working elsewhere. So I wouldn't see an exclusivity clause as particularly helpful to the employee. I wouldn't see it as a particularly great thing to kind of impose upon an employee, especially at the moment when the workforce is so decimated and people really just aren't there. So it's not something really that I think we've ever had a massive issue with. But again, I would be very interested to try and speak to the industry and look for further information about the prevalence of those.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think just referring back to my last point, given the very low levels of any 0-hour contracts within our membership, the exclusivity thing doesn't apply. Some of these workers have enough challenges holding down doing one part-time job, never mind having a multitude of others. So it really doesn't apply.
Okay, thank you. Mike, you're up.
Chair, thank you. And Glenn and Joel, thank you very much. 2 questions for both of you. So perhaps Joel first on the first one, then Glenn first on the second. So the first question is, when and how did you become aware of the consultation on this bill?
It's a fairly easy answer for me. I'm deputising for Colin Neal, who sends his apologies today. He's on business elsewhere. So it reached me kind of just at the end of last week, I think, or towards the end of last week. But I haven't had a great deal of discussion with either Hospitality Ulster staff or the membership on it. So it's been fairly short term, to be honest.
Glenn?
Yeah, through the chair, Mike. I suppose, like Joel, when your very efficient staff contacted us, and obviously, given the timescales, it was a bit of a challenge given everything else that we have on. But I was aware that the private members bill was doing the rounds, and obviously, because I think that our sector has moved on and it has become less of an issue, obviously, I know Jim has worked hard in terms of the consultation, of our private members bill. So really, it wasn't that the first detailed comment that we made on it is obviously talking to your good selves this morning.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Second question is about gender bias. Does a 0 hours contract regime impact more on men or women?
Well, as I've said, it's hard to say because obviously the 0-hour contract, as I've said, is less of an issue for our members. But you're looking at many of those part-time workers. I mean, it's wrong to say that, there are many sort of people, male and female, who have increasing caring responsibilities. And so it's not just, I think, it's not right just to stereotype part-time retail workers as being the majority female. We have a growing number of older retirees, who are male, who want to work part-time. They want to keep themselves active. So, our workforce, whether part-time or full-time, is very, very diverse. And I think there are obviously, whether you're male or female, there are great opportunities within the retail sector to work part-time. Our members are always trying to be flexible, no matter if you're a single mum, a single dad, or someone with caring responsibilities, or you're a student. So it's, the gender profile of our member staff is very, very diverse indeed.
Joel?
Yeah, I would probably agree with Glenn on that. Unfortunately, I wish I had sort of a breakdown of the number of 0 hours contracts in the industry and sort of the makeup of those in terms of gender diversity. Unfortunately, I don't have that data to hand, but I would agree with Glenn in that it suits more a lifestyle than a specific gender or a stage in life that someone is at. So single parenting is not just done by mothers, and there are many sort of circumstances under which someone actively seeks out hospitality for that opportunity to supplement their income or have kind of 1 or 2 extra days per week. But unfortunately, I don't have any data to sort of to highlight that or explore it any further. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Mike. Peter?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I find it very useful. I appreciate, I suppose, the caveat that we're operating under, which is that because of the time frames that are being dealt with, and I suppose because there wasn't that direct engagement at the consultation stage reaching this point, you're giving sort of, I suppose, an expert opinion, but it's a bit of a snapshot of your sector rather than one that's obviously you've been able to draw down from direct side of things on it. And I suppose where we're coming from as well, as you indicated, this particular piece of legislation in terms of time frame won't make the statute books. So I suppose where we're looking, I suppose, is to drill down evidence, because clearly in the next mandate there'll clearly be something with a longer time frame which we brought in, you know, that will deal with the issue. So I suppose it's about trying to get that correct. I suppose then I've a few sort of questions in relation to this. In that, I think if I'm picking you up, first of all, in terms of the position, I think I suppose particularly Glyn mentioned about the unique situation in terms of employment law. I suppose first of all to get a sense of dealing with this issue. Is it an issue which is able simply to be dealt with discreetly as an issue in and of itself in terms of the 0 hours, or is there a wider context that it should form part of a wider review of employment law? So just to get, I suppose, first of all, I thought in relation to that.
Well, through the Chair, Peter, thank you for your question. I think we've always taken the view that we need any review of employment law needs to be, in the one sense, family-friendly, worker-friendly and business-friendly as well, and particularly given 98% of all business in Northern Ireland is small. At times when governments have looked at employment law, they have really looked at the prism of big business, smaller business, and how it impacts on smaller business. So I think it is important that, you know, whatever is reviewed in the next mandate, that it very much looks at through the prism of small business, independent retailers, because that is where our economy is. That is where it will be in this foreseeable future. So we've got to have whatever review of employment law, something that works for the worker and works for the business owner. And you know, a lot of the dialogue we have with Ulster and so on, and you know, has been, you know, it hasn't been through government. It has been the relationships that we've built in, the campaigns that we've worked on, and indeed we proactively wanted to address some of the challenges facing member staff when we published our comprehensive wellbeing plan in December of last year. So we take this issue very carefully. I think it will be interesting to see what is in the next programme of government, and I think that is probably where a lot of this will be looked at again, because I think the world has moved on since January 2019. Not least the difficulties many workers and independent retailers. And of course, if you look at this, in 2022 we have a perfect storm of cost issues facing business, from rising energy costs to increases in national insurance. And plus as well, many of those businesses that have not paid rates in the last 2 years will be starting to pay rates again. We have cost of living issues and of course an inflation problem as well. So, you know, whatever is looked at has to be in the sense of making sure that we can lock in economic growth, we can start our economy growing again, bouncing back from the pandemic, but also making sure that the rights of workers and our employees, and you know, we haven't been shy in I suppose shouting out about the huge contribution our retail staff have made during the pandemic, you know, and you know, if you look at the figures that Ulster have produced, you know, that double, nearly treble the amount of verbal abuse, physical abuse of retail staff have suffered during the pandemic when they're reminding customers of their legal responsibilities, whether it's face cover, social distance, or anyone else. So we owe our retail staff a huge amount of gratitude, and and I think our members will always want to go to the extra mile, look after and keep those staff. And what we've said, in our wellbeing plan is a happy, contented workforce is absolutely key to boosting Northern Ireland's very low levels of productivity. So I think we're very clear that you have an economic and physical recovery in one hand, but that also has to go alongside the wellbeing recovery as well. So a lot of the issues that's touched in this private members bill directly to a bigger picture, and a lot of those points are touched upon in our wellbeing plan. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, second issue, I should say as well before maybe I ask the second question, and I suspect I speak for everybody on the committee, I think it is important that we place on record as well our thanks to retail and hospitality workers throughout the pandemic, because in many ways, particularly as regards restrictions, as workers, they've probably been more affected by restrictions than the vast majority of people within society, but also have been very much on the front line of a certain level of enforcement as well, and sometimes had to bear the brunt of either resentment or frustration, or indeed at times utterly unacceptable behaviour sometimes from customers, a minority of customers as well. I suppose the second issue I just wanted to touch on is that I suppose if you're summing up both your evidence in effectively a phrase, it's a need to retain flexibility but ensure that abuse doesn't happen. I think that seems to be a common theme of both of you. But I suppose where I maybe want to tease out, particularly with Joel on this particular side of things, in terms of the solution which is offered by the bill of reaching a point at which banded hours, a guaranteed sort of banded hours comes into effect, and a particular trigger point for that. It seemed to be fairly clear from maybe there's a difference of impact to some extent, that from the perspective of retail, Glenn was largely saying 0 hours contracts is very rare nowadays in retail, and effectively the standard practice is simply be there to move towards sort of banded hours. Joel, I wanted to ask yourself, from the perspective of hospitality, because there may or may not be more complexities within the situation as regards hospitality, do you think by way of a solution which resolves or at least as much as possible resolves the flexibility but avoiding abuse bit, that the banded hours solution is the route to go down? And I suppose the second question with that then is, you highlighted also perhaps a little bit of a differentiation between how you would treat employees who would be there on a slightly longer term situation from the very casual employees of, in terms of the level of flexibility that would be, say, a student being back at Christmas who may be doing a couple of weeks' work in that regard. So I suppose the secondary point within the issue, if depending on what your view on the banded hours as a route, the bill obviously then highlights a 3-month period as being the trigger point at which then that could be done. Do you think that that is the appropriate time frame? Maybe just get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And you're right in saying that I think my industry and Glenn's industry, we probably sing off the same hymn sheet for the vast majority of things here. I do agree with what Glenn's saying in terms of sort of a review of employment procedures and whatever else. That for hospitality, I guess the difference is, we're probably the same in that we need to sort of account for the vulnerabilities in both of our industries in terms of the businesses themselves in the current climate. But the difference, I suppose, between retail and hospitality would be the more seasonal nature of hospitality, the more unpredictable element of when that trade comes. Obviously Christmas is a time when the hospitality industry, makes probably the vast majority of its kind of turnover or profit for the year. It's not always guaranteed business in the same way that maybe a retail store opens and can predict that sort of daily flow of customers. As hospitality comes out of the pandemic, we're seeing it being more occasional, more based on events and functions, and indeed more seasonal. So the difference there would be, the concern would be that you would have possibly smaller outlets who have staff on the books who maybe don't have that flexibility. Then they're maybe in a position where they contractually must offer a team of employees a certain set amount of hours, but have absolutely no guarantee that the actual work will be there. And maybe Glenn will argue with me here, and please feel free to. But obviously, I think anyway, you could probably predict the footfall and the customer flow of retail in a way that you certainly at the moment anyway cannot with hospitality. So that business vulnerability at the moment, and not only at the moment, because I understand the bill is obviously for the long term, but as we continue to move and to sort of continue to evolve post-pandemic, it would probably, and again, apologies, I'm speaking without having consulted the members directly on this, but it would probably be an area of concern for those smaller businesses where they are then tied without the option of having those zero-hour workers for those kinds of functions and things. But again, I stress the caveat that this is something that cannot be abused, and we would certainly be keen to work along with the committee to explore ways in which that abuse can be prevented.
And just, I suppose, in relation to if it is the banded hours, and I appreciate the concerns that you've raised and maybe the caveats on that, is a 3 month the appropriate time for that to kick in if that's the route it's gone down?
Yeah, I mean, I again, apologies. We need to probably look at the specifics, but it's more the model of bringing someone on and then offer, being compelled, I suppose, to offer a certain set of hours would be the issue versus the actual time frame that needs to pass before that offer is made. But look, that's something that we can certainly explore further with the membership and ask for their opinions on.
I mean, and I suppose from the point of view, and this is where I suppose there can be a bit of differentiation between hospitality and retail. I suppose as we look towards a post-pandemic, I mean, we hope we're all moving to a post-pandemic situation, but I suppose, unfortunately, at times over the last 2 years, we've seen light at the end of the tunnel, and sometimes has moved in the opposite direction. I suppose the fact that, from the point of view of volatility, not just, I mean, there's obviously a natural volatility for hospitality because of the fact of it's probably a little bit more seasonally driven than retail in that regard. But I suppose, given the fact that it has often been the case that in terms of first port of call for restrictions have tended to be geared ultimately towards hospitality, that obviously creates a level of nervousness. Very final point just want to raise within the bill, it also then, I think, in terms of making further regulations, puts potential onus on the department to particularly have sort of due regard for, I think, firstly, the best international practice, whatever that is discerned to be, and also then for the views of particularly trade unions and groups that are connected up with zero-hour contractors. I just wonder, maybe a little bit of a leading question, but from the point of view of then, if we were looking at that particular element of things, would it also be the case that the views of organisations like yourselves should also then, perhaps on the face of any form of legislation, be something which would have to be taken into account as well by the department, or just maybe just get your general reaction to that particular subsection of the clause?
Well, without going into some too much detail on the bill, I think it's fair to say that it raises a much broader issue in terms of how we support employees, how we support workers, and also how we ensure that flexibility is there for businesses. So it actually taps into a much wider issue, which I suspect may well be revisited in the next programme of government. It could be that many of your own party manifestos, as we approach the Assembly election perhaps want to look at this and bring forward ideas that are based on international good practice. But all I would say is this, that the wellbeing agenda is not just something that business needs to talk about, it needs to act on it. And that's why that we wanted to put that template there, a template that could be adapted to any of our members. And I think that we get back to this, that happy, contented staff that are looked after, that their well-being is front and centre, is absolutely key to the future improvement of the productivity of the Northern Ireland economy. We've traditionally some of the lowest productivity levels in the UK. And if we can get to a point where we have a happy, contented staff that are well looked after, then I think that is so important to not just the viability of our member stores, but also the economy as a whole. And I've said, this recovery from the pandemic has two elements to it, economic and well-being. And the two are so interlinked. And I don't believe that we can do one without the other.
I suppose Glenn, just though to maybe slightly labour the point, and again, I appreciate this can be seen as a slightly leading question, but I suppose, do you feel that in the same way, I think everyone would accept that it's right that whenever the conversations will then be had about the detail of regulations, that the trade unions are very much at the heart of that conversation, that business organisations like yourselves should also be at the heart of that conversation?
Absolutely. I think the whole concept of social dialogue is a good one. We've not only good relationships with USDOR, but also NIGIC too as well, so we have regular conversations. And if you've seen that business and trade unions and indeed the voluntary sector have come together, whether it's some of the challenges around the protocol, whether it is co-designing some of the responses to the pandemic. And indeed, I would also highlight that the role of trade unions, business and the voluntary sector working with the executive in the current discussions on the High Street Task Force. That is a really good example where civic society is coming together and co-designing solutions with the executive. And I think that's a good model. And what I would say, Peter, I would go further. I think we've always said, if you look at the programme for government process, and it is a very convoluted, difficult process, which the Assembly and Executive arrives at a programme government. What I think business and trade unions and the voluntary sector need to be is not just seen as consultees, but as partners in the programme for government, because there are clearly KPIs in any programme for government that our members need to be doing. And likewise, I think it is about co-designing many of the solutions. And so, what I would say, looking ahead to the next Assembly term, whether it's employment law or anything else, I think Northern Ireland civic society, in many respects, is the envy of anywhere else in these islands, because it has been very solution-based. We work together very well. There isn't the same sort of confrontational approach between unions and business that you would see in other parts of this island or the UK. I think that is a good thing that we need to build on, and we need to make sure that civic society voice is not just seen as a tick the box, as just a consultee, but as a partner in co-designing the next programme of government, and obviously navigating through the huge challenges we face in 2022 and 2023. Making sure that we are locking in that post-pandemic recovery and building something very, very different than what we had in January 2019. It's not about going back to where we were in January 2019. It's about, I'm not even going to use the term building back better, it's about doing something fundamentally different and, above all else, something that is better than what we had before.
Peter, if I could just come in after Glenn there, I think that's probably a fairly astute answer that we broadly agree on. I can't sit here this morning and talk about an employer's charter, an employee welfare package, and the critical need for the industry to look after its employees, but without acknowledging that it's very important that the sort of viewpoints of the trade unions are taken. But it also, I would say, needs to be a collaborative approach, which also explores the viability of any bill or any sort of review to the actual businesses themselves. We are unfortunately in what will be an extended period of extreme volatility, and there are businesses that unfortunately still to come probably won't be viable in the next year or 2 years, whenever grants go away, whenever rates are back to full whack. So it's important that we probably engage with the businesses and business groups in the same way as we engage with trade unions, to ensure that any sort of development is viable on the business end.
Thanks, Peter. Keith?
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thank you, Colin and Joel. My question, in the paper, Colin, Lynn, you've 1,800 membership. What does that equate to in workers? And the same question to you, Joel. What does that equate to in workers, whether full-time or part-time? So what is the range of people underneath that membership?
Well, I think firstly, we're not far off the 2,000 mark now, Keith. So we're very steadily. It's really hard to say because our membership is not just retail. I mean, our membership takes in wholesalers, retailers, and suppliers to the sector. So we have some very big players in that, and we have some very, very small players in that. So I think it is very hard to put an exact figure. Firstly, what the contribution is to the overall Northern Ireland economy and indeed the staff, but I would certainly put the overall economic contribution certainly in billions, and obviously staff well, and certainly tens of thousands. So it's hard to put an exact figure on it. Particularly with the vast majority of members are small, independent, family-owned, independent retailers. So their staff levels would vary. But it is a very, very significant section of the Northern Ireland economy, making a huge contribution. And again, independent retailers, we have independent retailers that are the envy of any other part of this island or the rest of the UK. And you know what? That's a good thing. And in many respects, if it wasn't for those independent retailers, whether they're convenience or butchers or pharmacy, who were there when people needed them in the height of lockdown, we owe those businesses a huge debt because they were as much a service, a lifeline for many older and vulnerable people, as GPs or any of the other social services were, in the pandemic. And that's something we need to very much build on. But to answer your question, where our collective membership is a huge chunk of the Northern Ireland economy.
And yeah, if I follow on again, thank you for the question. These are obviously sort of pre-pandemic figures, and we are still in that period of flux as we wait to see sort of the shape in which the industry builds back post-pandemic. But the hospitality sector before March 2020 anyway sustained over 60,000 jobs across Northern Ireland, which equates to just over 1 in 20 jobs in NI being in the hospitality sector. Of those, 45,000 are directly in food and drink, and the sector contributed over 1.1 billion to the Northern Ireland economy annually.
So, Joel and Glenn, I'm taking from your previous comments that if you had the choice, I'm not personally saying the bill's not needed, but are you saying the bill's not needed?
Well, I think that firstly, I think the market and the economy has moved on. I mean, certainly, I can only speak for my sector. As a practice, it was very much in decline, and the ONS figures prove that. It was very much, if you look at the broader economy, it was very much a practice that was in decline pre-pandemic. If you look at those 2019 figures, that only 1.3% of workers across the whole economy had zero-hour contracts. I think that translated in about 11,000 workers in 2019. I would say that situation is probably even lower. The issue of zero-hour contracts for retail is not a big issue. That's not to say it's not an issue for sectors, but I think the world has moved on, and perhaps when this issue and this bill is perhaps reinvisited, and something that I had a good chat with Gemma about, that it might need to be added and adapted to where we will be, because this economy is rapidly changing. This is not the same economy we had in January 2019. Certainly not the same retail sector or high streets that we had in 2019. So it might be that if bill is revisited, that it might need to be added to. Or, for instance, it might be that the new programme of government might want to take on a lot of these issues in a broader context. So, I mean, this bill's not going to be passed in this term. So, I mean, it might well be that whatever new programme of government takes on elements of this bill, that mean it may not be needed. Who knows? I mean, we have a long way to go between now and then. You know, we're sort of fairly relaxed about what's in the bill. But I do think that perhaps this will be a broader issue. And on all the points that Joel and myself and all the members have made today, I think it all points to looking at a perhaps wider strategy, after the next election.
Yeah, look, long before the pandemic was thrust upon us, that sort of journey of professionalisation in the hospitality industry, it had been ongoing for some time with regard to, the building of apprenticeship frameworks, with regard to positioning it as a career of choice from school age up, and showing that there are pathways to have a very successful career in hospitality. I'm not going to claim that we're all 100% perfect. Who is? There will be premises that in the past haven't, necessarily treated staff right. But the last 2 years have shone a light on the critical need to treat your people well, to look after your staff, to make sure that they have a good standard of living, a good work-life balance, and those kinds of projects that the Hospitality Ulster are currently undertaking with regard to the Employers' Charter, the Employee Welfare Scheme. It's only seeking to kind of back that up. Look, I agree with Glenn in that we're still in a period of flux. We're looking to see over the next year, 2 years, what kind of shape the industry's in, what the workforce looks like. But the need for caring for your employees, for providing what they need, be that a career pathway if it's what they're looking for, or a stopgap solution to supplement income, it's very important, and it's now more important than ever. It always has been extremely important that our businesses take care of their people, and I think that that's going to continue in earnest. So I'm not sure that I can say that the bill isn't needed without sort of some meaningful consultation with the industry and with those businesses. But I certainly will say that process has been ongoing for a long time and will now continue in earnest because of the economic situation we find ourselves in.
And one final quick question, if I may, Chair, and presume a quick answer, gentlemen. Have you reached out to your membership to get their feedback, and then are you feeding back obviously to tell us, but I presume if you've started that process?
Well, what I would say, Chair, given that we were only given more or less just over a week, it would be impossible for us to do that. We're engaged in a range of other things, from the High Street Task Force right through to a huge amount of issues around the Northern Ireland Protocol. So for us to turn around and do something as detailed as this, but all I would say is, Keith, that we did talk to as many members as we could within that context, and I think the feedback then is that those 0-hour contracts for many of our members aren't there anymore. It is, I'm not saying it's not an important issue for other sectors, but it is considerably less of an issue for our members. We don't represent the large supermarkets, so I can't really give a view about what their employment practices are, but I think just talking to some of our small members, some of our medium and large members, that they do not have 0-hour contracts, and staff do have those sort of maybe not quite banded hours, but they have 10 or 16 hours contracts. So they have clear contracts of what's required of them and a minimum level of hours, which quite often is exceeded, as pressures would be, the dreaded sort of, flow test and getting your 2 red lines, it puts the fear of God, not just of people who are tested positive, but also many small independent retailers, they're 4 or 5 staff and maybe have 1 or 2 of them off at very short notice and having to isolate. So yes, it is a challenge.
Yeah, the short answer to the member's question is unfortunately no, for the same reasons that Glenn has outlined there. However, Hospitality Ulster's position on any topic is formed by engaging with the industry, engaging with our membership, and engaging with our board. Our board is made up of business owners of all kind of shapes and sizes from all over the province. So any sort of position that we form very much comes from that engagement. So it would be important to do that before we had any sort of hard line on the issue.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Keith. Stuart?
Yes, just very briefly, listening to both of you this morning, I guess that probably the good news story is that from both industries that are being described, you don't believe there's any level of concern about zero-hour contracts. You don't actually think, particularly Glenn indicating that he doesn't think there are very many of them in existence in the type of membership organisation that he represents. So that's a useful takeaway from our conversation today, and research and further examination will show that. And Joel's indicated that he will be going back to his member organisation just to work out the extent of 0 hours and the impact of this bill. But just in the broader context, the Minister has indicated to us, although we've now reached the end or reaching the end of this mandate, that a future economy minister would want to bring forward a more comprehensive and wide-reaching employment relations legislation, which may very well incorporate this and many other things that have been outstanding for some time in Northern Ireland. Do you think that approach is a better approach rather than dealing with small, and I use this word not critically, but small niche areas like zero-hour contracts? And should we not be actually looking at a slightly bigger picture, drawing all of this type of legislation into one encompassing bill?
Well, I think that's a very fair point you make, Stuart. I think that what I would say that whatever process, and I just don't think it should be a standard, consultation and then the committees take a look at it. I think it has to be about co-design. It has to be about ensuring, yes, that we have family-friendly employment law which looks after employees and respect and gives them good standards of conditions, but also the fact that we are a small business economy, and so whatever we have to have or changes to employment law, and there's been huge changes in years, that it has to be balanced in terms of working for the employee and working for our small business sector, which does make out the vast majority of the economy in Northern Ireland. So it might well be that this is reviewed, and of course, so many of the employment law, quite often could be, parallel or consent mechanisms from Westminster-based legislation that is coming through. We also have the situation where obviously many of the European directives in relation to employment law don't apply in the same way as they would before, now that we're out of the EU. So it might well be that this is looked at again, and we're very happy to have an ongoing dialogue with the Minister about what their priorities are, providing it makes that we do get a balanced approach which works for the employee and works for the employer as well.
Thank you.
Sure, there isn't really much I can add to that. That's a fairly, again, comprehensive answer from Glenn. Hospitality also would certainly be keen to sort of work collaboratively to look at, a wider review of employment practices if it's something brought forward. Obviously the labour market has growing challenges for our industry. It's been made a lot worse by the inability to access EU labour. Businesses in the hospitality industry have to now compete in what is a very limited labour market. So it's critically important for our industry to demonstrate opportunities, to demonstrate benefits, to make hospitality a career of choice, but also to offer that flexibility that people actively seek our industry out for. But it's important to do that in a collaborative manner, which ensures that there is no abuse of that at all, that offers it without any abuse. But certainly it wouldn't be something that we would object to.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Stuart. Can we bring Claire into the spotlight, please?
Hi, Chair. Can you see me? No?
No, we can't, but we can hear you.
Is that all right? Sorry, I don't know. I don't know what's happening there because my camera's on, but I don't know. No, look, thank you. I appreciate this. It's always interesting as usual. And I suppose I would have come into this conversation thinking that this is something that we definitely, that we need. Albeit, I do see the limitations in terms of the time that we have left in order to develop it correctly. And I would be quite keen to ensure maybe more of a consideration of it in the next mandate. I suppose just in terms of 0-hour contracts as well. Perhaps you've already answered this in some respects. Is there thought that maybe there isn't an issue now because we're not aware of it? Because I think by the very nature of it, and the way people are employing, and I appreciate there's lots of constraints out there in terms of small businesses and just getting employees generally, but. Is the issue a hidden one rather than one that isn't necessarily just not an issue anymore? And I say that and not as a criticism of employers, because I recognise that if it is a hidden issue, then it can impact businesses as much as the employees. So.
Well, I think.
Sorry, Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, Claire. I mean, obviously, when we were doing this, obviously we didn't have the time to do a deep dive within our membership on this, but we did talk to USDA about this and what their perspective is, and they're very clear that 0-hour contracts, and they would be more across the obviously retail workers in many respects than what we would be. But they were very clear that 0-hour contract, whilst they want to see them ban, are not a widespread practice within the retail sector anymore. So I think that, but obviously given a week's notice, it was very hard for us to do anything extensive on this, and I mean, I think we're Hospitality Ulster ourselves are the only two business groups that I think have agreed to give evidence on this, and we're always very happy to do that, but obviously we can't, you couldn't expect us to do anything terribly deep a week's notice.
Yeah, no, look, I fully appreciate that, and I think it's very generous of you to even come and present to the committee, just given the limited time. But and for me at this point, these types of pieces of legislation that have been put in toward the end of the mandate are an opportunity to be picked up again in the next mandate. And hopefully it starts to get people thinking about that. So I think that's the best we can hope for at this point.
Okay, thank you, Claire. I don't have anybody else indicating to come in for questions. So look, just to say thanks to you both for coming along and for taking the time to talk to us, and we appreciate it. It was at quite short notice. Obviously we're under time pressure as well in terms of trying to get a report done before the end of the mandate. I think there has been some fairly positive stuff come out of this morning's briefing. Obviously, Glenn, as you said, I'm familiar with the Retail NI Wellbeing Plan. Also good to hear about the Employers Charter from Hospitality Ulster, and I think really important issues that have been highlighted in respect of work-life balance and well-being that I do think we will be looking at again in the next mandate, and obviously well-being is a focus that does need to be included in a future programme for government. I think we're coming at from an employment law and an employment right perspective is some of these things definitely need to be codified in legislation, and I think that this obviously has sparked a conversation around 0 hours contracts, which was an NDNA commitment in terms of banning them, so we will need to return to that, but there are other important employment issues that do need to be looked at as well. So look, unless you have anything you want to add just in closing, thanks very much for coming along. Go ahead, Glenn.
I think, I suspect the last time I'll be presenting to your committee in this mandate. So again, thank you, Chair, and to Peter and to all the team, whatever, and members as well. For I think your committee has been leading from the front throughout, not just in the short term with this mandate, but I think that you have been, I think, a very effective committee that's cheerleaded for our economy. And again, I wish you all the very best.
Yeah, if I could echo what my colleague says there, and I know that the members probably engage much more with Colin, but certainly we've always enjoyed a very collaborative kind of working relationship, and we're grateful for that. And thank you for the opportunity to speak to you this morning.
I would certainly echo those comments. I think that the level of collaboration we've had over the past 2 years, and in particular in relation to the pandemic, has been invaluable in helping us to be able to respond. So obviously that appreciation is reciprocated.
Thank you, and I hope that Starleaf is a thing of the past the next time.
Thank you.
The Betamax virtual meeting.
Okay, members, so Peter, just supposed to pick up from that, are there anything we need to do specifically out of
Chair,
those?
what we'll do is
briefings?
we'll get copies of the two agreements, the Employers' Charter and the Wellbeing Plan, because I think it's just interesting how they feed into the whole issue of treatment of employees and well-being and so on. I think it also picks up on what has been suggested by both Joel and Glyn, and also what members have highlighted is that there is a bigger piece of legislative work there. It is 6 years since the last Employment Act that did look at 0 hours contracts, and there simply wasn't time to complete, and it dropped off the edge, which means the consultations that were done, the more depth there was in those at that point, is a bit out of date post-pandemic or in the pandemic, or the scene has changed because of the pandemic. So I think there is only limited work we can do as a committee chair in terms of that sort of surveying, but it has allowed those views to come out, and those will be reflected in the report.
Yeah, Chair, let me preface what I'm going to say by saying I have no question, I'm not questioning the sincerity of the bill sponsor in her intent to protect workers from exploitation, to introduce more certainty in terms of hours and work. But I have developed a block here over the way the consultation has been conducted. We heard what the two witnesses today had to say, but more importantly, from my point of view, the bill sponsor, when she was with us, said she'd consulted heavily with the women's sector. But there's a letter in the pack from the Women's Resource and Development Agency, which says, and I quote, 3 weeks to provide evidence on a call for views is absolutely not an acceptable time frame, and is certain to exclude women's voices.
So that is in relation to
That's
our
3 weeks.
call for
Our
evidence,
3 weeks, our
and
call.
they go on to say in that response that they responded to Gemma's consultation, and they are asking us to use their submission to Gemma's consultation
They have then
in our
forwarded that.
call for evidence.
And I think
December one, yeah.
Yeah.
the part of the issue for us has been now trying to schedule the oral evidence. So we are hoping we'll get them in. We're now looking at the 23rd. But absolutely, the 3 weeks that we put out the survey for, we would not do that if we were not.
I think we're...
But it doesn't reference Gemma's survey, Ms. Dolan's survey. That's us. That's our
Right.
call for evidence. Apologies if that wasn't clear.
I still think it's quite damning.
It absolutely is, Chair. We have a process we follow for every bill, and what the current situation means is that that process is massively curtailed in terms of the time. So normally we would have 6 to 8 weeks at least for that process, and we'd also have more time to, I'm going to use the phrase gentle along, targeted written responses. Where, as the gentleman said this morning, literally, can you come next week? So that we can get some perspective on these sectors in relation to the bill. But as both Glyn and Joel have said, there was no opportunity really for them to do much of a deep dive.
So, because I have great sympathy for the point that has been made by the Women's Policy Group in responding to the bill, because we obviously would prefer that people have the opportunity to respond in detail, but Gemma has provided her consultation responses to us, so that we are able to use those, and that is what the Women's Policy Group has asked us to use. But it would be
And they have
good.
forwarded that on as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, just, I mean, look, I think I would have a lot of sympathy with Mike's point in relation to this. Look, I think where we're in a slightly difficult position is, I think, procedurally, we have no alternative other than to produce a report saying, here's the evidence we've received, etc., etc. I think with the onus is on the thing, there was, first of all, I think that in terms of any, and I appreciate we're not at the final point in relation to this, but I think we do have to incredibly heavily caveat any report and caveat the fact that actually, in terms of from a committee point of view, because of the constraints that were on us, we did not have adequate time to do that. And organisations, by their nature, did not have adequate time to respond. And I think to take the point, you know, there may well be particular responses that have been given to Gemma's consultation, which I perfectly accept. But we're also aware, again, and we saw even from this morning, that while I think we got from Glyn and Joel, we got a very sort of professional response. They're people who are knowledgeable in that area. But they were having to do a certain level of gut reaction side of things. So they've not had the opportunity to be able to consult within their own sectors. So they're given, if you like, a flavour of what they think to be the case, but without really a great deal of evidential basis on it. And I think that is one of the flaws that has been there with the initial consultation, that organisations like that weren't put. So, you know, I think at the very least, if we, because I think if we don't have any other alternative but to produce a report, but I think we have to incredibly circumscribe that or heavily do that with the fact of where we are in terms of consultation and the limitations that we've had, and the limitations of perhaps failure at the first stage to be able to draw in that level of consultation.
Yeah, Chair, I think there's a much broader issue here which came out very clearly at the last meeting of the all-party group on UNSCR 1325, Women, Peace and Security, which is the demands on the women's sector to respond to consultations. And in fact, the author of this letter then goes on to say, I think there was no fewer than 7 live consultations that she and her body were expected to respond to. So we're adding and playing into that, and I'm really, really uncomfortable with it. I emphasise I'm with the bill sponsor in terms of the intent, but I don't think we should be part of increasing a problem that has been identified.
Chair, if it's any use, we have already discussed that issue of very heavily caveating. And we've said that to every respondee as well, that this is a very, very shallow scrutiny.
They're just letting you know you're not on mute. Sorry, go ahead.
So that is absolutely the 80% of a bill report is a reflection of here's what the bill says, here's the intention. About 20% is, and here's the evidence we've had on that, and here's where we conclude. The largest part of the bill is really, or the largest part of the report is really explaining what the bill does. And that we do almost as an automatic process, and that's in hand now. Everything else will be very heavily caveated, and it'll also be highlighted in the committee's legacy report. I think there is, because this is going no further, there is some value in starting a conversation, and that's all this is really going to be, and that will be the caveat. Obviously, members will approve a report, but one of the key recommendations will be the need for a continuation of scrutiny and discussion around the issue, particularly if the department is at a point where it's able to bring forward any kind of employment rights bill in the new mandate, and depending on how quickly that is. I know it's been their intention, but we haven't had really any clarity on content, scope, or anything else. But absolutely, if it's reassuring at all to members, this is not an adequate level of scrutiny, and that will be very, very clearly marked on the bill report.
That sounds like something I can support. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks.
Just a question. How many organisations, Peter, Stroke Chair, have we requested information to come back by the 25th? Because you hear today that they basically said, I'm going to be phrasing, he didn't say this, but I'm going to say it, it's only a waste of time, it's not going anywhere. So how many's going to come back, and how many say it's worthwhile coming back?
what we've done is we have a dual process where our survey goes out, and that's online, and we're highlighting it, and we use social media to guide specific groups to it. Then there's the targeted requests we've put out, including to the gentleman this morning, and other business groups and other groups more generally, the women's sector and so on, where we're writing to them saying, look, we have a survey, but really you're key people here, and we'd like to hear more from you. If you can fill in the survey, great, and you're willing to put your name to it. And there's options within the survey for a longer written response. But ideally, you want to be able to bring those people in. And in a normal process, over a normal period of time, we would probably have a number of months to do that, and we would be able to get everybody in and have them in where they feel prepared and where they have consulted their memberships. I think this is an issue that is now going to be common across any committees getting to a committee stage of a bill at this point, and fracking won't be any different once we get down that road. So that's why it's important, and members did highlight last week that the process isn't adequate, and this is simply, here's some evidence, and obviously the Hansard will make it very clear that the groups that are coming in and talking to the committee have not had an adequate amount of time, and obviously any correspondence, including the letter in the pack today, will go into that report. So there will be absolute clarity on that point, that this has been a very non-best practice committee stage. But again, what I'll highlight is that it falls within the 30 days that's statutory, and how inadequate that is, and how I have never been in a position before now where a committee has been effectively forced by timescales to turn around a report within the 30 working days. We've never done that before, certainly in any committee I've been attached to. So I know that's now an issue that's going to be looked at going forward. But the very fact that a 30 working day statutory period is anywhere in law just highlights that process does need changed, and that the pretty much permanent use of a motion to extend is really not enough, because it does give the impression that this can be turned around in 30 working days, and it simply can't. Not with the amount of process good process we now have with our surveys online and so on.
And how many have we contacted then? How many, roughly?
So, I'm going to say
We asked the students.
we've pushed it out to at least 15 specifically. The survey itself is on citizen space, and we direct our stakeholders there, as does every other committee, because we all have it in our own sort of, it's an NI Assembly space on citizen space. We'll also make use of our colleagues in comms to, and I don't honestly know how it technically works, but they can make social media work specifically to target the groups we want to talk to. So believe me, I have no idea how that works, but I know it does. And usually we would do that at the start of a process and at the middle point. When you're only doing it for 3 weeks, that's very condensed, and you will all know from considerable experience within the room around committees and around inquiries and bill reports that a lot of people don't respond until towards the end of the consultation, because they've put out an initial email perhaps to their membership that's going to take time, and they do reminders and so on. And you need a number of weeks for that, and we are always or previously we've always been in a position where we have months after we close our call for evidence, so there's always an opportunity to bring in new evidence, particularly if we hear something said in an oral evidence session that makes the committee think, well, actually there's a whole other area there. That's simply not going to happen in this, because there is not time. Sorry, Mr. O'Dowd, Chair.
Well, maybe just a word of caution, particularly for those listening in around legislation. The Speaker has tasked the whips of all the parties to go back and meet again to discuss how they ensure as much legislation gets through this mandate of the Assembly as possible without diminishing the need for proper scrutiny of all legislation. So that's the task the Speaker has set us now. Any piece of legislation that's currently being processed has the potential to be completed in this mandate. There's a number of mechanisms which the Assembly can take to speed up the process. And some of that, most of that has to be said, has to take place after the committee scrutiny stage. But if there's consultees listening, my advice to them will be to, as best as they can, respond to consultations on legislation, because a bill you think, oh, that won't make it, just might make it. So, caution.
Very sobering thought.
Chair, I mean, without, I mean, like, I appreciate it's a wider discussion on it. It does strike me, I have to say, that's not a particularly good formula for making good law, to be perfectly honest on it, on that basis. If we are doing, if we're saying this is just, shall we say, a sausage factory of get things out as quickly as possible, never mind the quality.
No, well, at first I did say, without setting aside proper scrutiny.
No, I appreciate that, but I would still be very, I mean, look, but I suspect it's a wider debate from anything that's happening necessarily in this committee.
Chair, with this bill, we go to the 21st of March, which allows us to complete the week before our last meeting. And the 21st of March, theoretically, is one of the final sitting days. So I'm hopeful that that will mean that, that's maybe not the right wording, but you know what I mean? I don't think there's going to be any time for this bill to proceed beyond committee stage. Now, that's based on us seeking a one-week extension. With fracking, our timescale ends on the 23rd of March, which is the final committee day. As I said before, theoretically, I don't think we can extend beyond that. That would take us off the mandate.
Chair, just a final thought for me, because I don't want to bang on about this, but it looks like we're now in a position where our call for views is going to be less rigorous and more open to criticism than the bill sponsors' consultation. That's not a good look for this committee.
If it's, and again, it's not really a reassurance, but we have done our work slightly differently, in that as well as our online survey, we are targeting all the key groups that we have identified. Now, in a longer process, we would have pretty much wanted to have the vast majority of them in. We aren't going to have the opportunity to do that, largely because of the short time scale and of people's availability. And as you've already pointed out, particularly the women's sector is under massive pressure in terms of consultation fatigue. And this is an issue we've heard from stakeholders before, particularly during COVID, where we are asking them, tell us about, but so is everyone else. And that wasn't even regarding legislation, that was when we were doing our micro-inquiries. And really all I suppose I can go back to is the bills are referred to committee. We have an automatic process we enter on, and the fallback position is the caveat that this is not how we would normally operate, that everything is short and complete, I suppose. Chair, Mr.
See on the fracking one, for example, and this is not the issue or indeed the bill sponsor, can we as a committee say, no, don't go out to call evidence? Yeah. Can we do that? I don't know the answer, that's why I'm asking.
Committee can do, as I've said on occasions before, committee can largely do as it wishes within its remit, and absolutely yes. What I would say with that is it means then the committee hasn't started any discussion or debate, and we've not gathered any evidence. And I think there's a difference between not having enough time and having some evidence out there to promote discussion going forward or next time round. I'm more confident in saying fracking has nowhere to go, because our end stage of committee, without even any extension, is literally after the final plenaries. Assuming the final plenaries on Monday and
committee
Tuesday.
set its face against the will of the Assembly. The will of the Assembly is that a bill goes to committee stage.
It's referred, but technically the committee is in charge of its own process.
I would.
We have process that we all agree, and I would be deeply uncomfortable not activating that process. I'd need to seek further clarity because we've not been in this position before.
So at what point, and sorry for this turn of the question, at what point does the fracking bill automatically process start? Obviously it was passed last night.
Today, we literally, it's referred to us today. We've had emails come through this morning from Business Office indicating that the bill stands referred.
At what point normally do you then go out to?
We would always have, we've started our preparation already in terms of surveying and who we would go out to. We're currently seeking to track down appropriate academics because we've heard from the lobbying sector in the area and Fermanagh and so on. So in terms of the time we have, we're kind of looking for what's the science behind that. But again, the committee publishes a bill report and can say in that bill report, here is some evidence, the caveat being that it's not complete, we only had a limited period. It's as Mr. O'Dowd says, not to do anything. I would need to explore whether that's necessarily an option. We always seek committee approval for our surveys and our lists of who to go out to. I suppose the committee could withhold its approval if the committee wanted to consider that. But I think my advice to the committee is that we have time to do something. The committee has time to do something, and anything that comes out of that time should simply be properly caveated. I'll also reiterate that it's very unlikely that either of these two bills, this bill or fracking, will move beyond committee stage unless something happens in that last week of the mandate, because literally one takes us to the Monday of that and the other one takes us to the Wednesday. Other bills, I think, that are nearing the end of committee stage are much more likely to be able to get through. But we're really only just starting committee stage now.
Just, I suppose, to point to me, I think, first of all, if there's a route that we kind of more or less have to go down, I think the route, and I take John's point about being seen to defy the Assembly, I think probably the route probably is to do whatever we have to do, but to not simply heavily caveat, but heavily caveat in flashing neon lights, if I can put it that way, and put it that terminology. The only thing I just want to check up, I assume this is the case, whenever the clerk talked about seeking academics in relation to that, is that simply receive evidence from them? I'm just thinking from that point of view. I know sometimes in the past that if there's maybe committees at times have engaged academics or experts almost on a consultancy type basis to be able to provide that. I'm conscious of the fact that I take very much Mike's point in terms of I think there's a reputational risk side of things, and also actually a proper process risk over where we're at. I think we would magnify that if we were then seen to be expending public money on something which, by everybody's estimation, is simply, in the short term, going under thing. But I'm assuming that seeking academics is simply, please send us on whatever information or evidence you have, rather than...
Chair, a big part of it's actually finding some first, and that's kind of where we are at the minute. It's not a situation we've had before where we've had to talk to people, you know, with a scientific background that would be appropriate to them giving evidence on fracking. And it's a call, so there is there's no payment here. It's not an engagement of an expert as a committee advisor or anything like that. Basically, because we don't have time, that process takes quite some time, a number of months.
And do we get raise?
Raise is being commissioned to do a paper. I have some concerns about whether there will be time for them to do that. Again, that's part of our process.
Different partners raise across because of all the various things. Presumably they're on a certain, I mean, a bit like, so I know they're slightly different position in regard, but I assume they're going to be under a certain level of information overload, which
we have
the stuff we get out of raise is very good, but there's also a slight degree of danger that if they're having to produce lots of stuff very quickly, whether just it would be quite the same quality.
And I would raise operates in a way that that would not be an issue in terms of the quality, purely because we negotiate with them and they tell us what they can do. For this bill, we have a date for a paper to be delivered in a briefing. For fracking, we're still at commissioning stage, so I would not be surprised to be told that Raise cannot deliver within a time frame. But again, I don't want to preempt what they're able to offer, but absolutely that's part of this discussion. And if it's any further comfort or reassurance to members, obviously this discussion is being broadcast and will form part of the minutes for the scrutiny of this bill. I think there is no danger that members' concern will not only be put in writing, the number of points in the committee report, but obviously there is live broadcast discussion of the issues that timescales have raised. And as I say, it will be as neon as we can possibly make it. And exactly the same with fracking. If we can organise, we're at a stage where I cannot even necessarily promise that we'll be able to organise oral evidence sessions on that, because the timescale will be even shorter. We're literally now in the last few weeks of committee meetings, and there is no guarantee, if we can get the right people, that we can get them to committee within a time frame.
Chair, it just seems to me to be all very rushed at the end, and I think that we need to just take a step back from all of this. There are learning points in all of this, which undoubtedly should go into the end of term report, as it were. There are issues, I think, for the Assembly on a wider basis. The Procedures Committee realistically needs to look at this, and I appreciate the role that the Speaker has, and I admire the ambition in the Speaker's office to allow members, particularly members, to bring forward private members' bills. But if those bills are either they will be, if they get to the very end stage and are finally approved by the Assembly, they will be deemed to be competent, but they may form part of a bigger picture. They may not just deliver exactly what it says on the tin, and I have concerns about that. So I think it might be important that for a future Assembly that a Procedures Committee gives serious consideration as to what happens when you get to this sort of, Mr. Weir said, sausage factory end of legislation, where there's a lot of stuff coming through and less time to give it the appropriate scrutiny in a committee. I think the work that this committee has done, and previous committees that I've been involved in, has been very detailed. We have taken a lot of time to take evidence. We've always extended the time, and even that is a technical issue. We have engaged widely with people, and like Mr. Nesbitt, I'm very concerned that an important stakeholder group like the Women's Network should be writing to us in the terms which they've done. And I think there are other organisations, if you look at fracking and other pieces of legislation, would be writing to us absolutely in similar terms by saying you're pushing us too hard, too fast, and you're going to make rush decisions about this. Committee is about taking space and time. COVID has restricted us, but if we were not in a COVID situation, we would have also been out on the ground, visiting groups, visiting places, and seeing for ourselves. All of that influences a committee in terms of how it delivers its report. So I am very concerned that we are in danger of damaging the work and reputation of the committee by rushing stuff at the end.
Well, as you said, Peter, our reports will reflect their limitations.
Chair, if it's also reassuring or useful, I'm aware from discussions internally that the Procedures Committee will be looking at all these issues going forward. This has been an exceptional time, the last couple of years, and as always, we have attempted to rise to the challenge of that. But I think the outside world will be in no doubt that the committee is under pressure and not delivering in the way it would prefer to, but will attempt to deliver what it can in the time that's left, and that caveat will be made very, very clear.
Okay, so We'll move on to our next item, which is, and we're probably not going to get through everything before.
No, Chair, we're not. We have about just over 10 minutes.
So do we want to do matters arising and maybe try for levelling up, and
If we
then
can get through those,
we
that'd be
can
great,
do
Chair.
correspondence
Yeah,
by
we'll do that by
correspondence?
correspondence.
Okay. Yep. Okay, so matters arising then, 5.1. There's correspondence from the Chair of Invest NI regarding the recruitment for a new CEO at page 39 of our packs. Invest NI is targeting having a new CEO in post from October 2022, following the anticipated publication of the Independent Lions Review report in September 2022, and obviously we have written to Michael Lyons to seek engagement around the review. So that's to note at this point, and that will be, I assume, organised in the next short while.
His office have come back, Chair. He is a small secretariat within the department, and they're talking to him now in terms of what can be done. There's a likelihood of us maybe having to look at that. Won't be done, not likely to be on the committee day. We may need to look at other times when we might be able to do that, because we're assuming that he will want that to be done in camera. But as soon as we have word on that, we'll come back.
Okay, that's grand. So 5.2 then, there's correspondence from the Managing Director of City of Derry Airport regarding airport issues at page 40. Obviously, just to remind members that the Executive is continuing to engage with the British Government regarding support for airports, so that is also for members to note.
Chair,
Peter,
I have a momentary update. We've so far gone out to 18 organisations, specifically and directly around the 0 hours contracts bill. See, WhatsApp's a great tool.
I just thought you were a good memory, but
No, I thought it was about half a dozen, but
Yours not
or a
19?
dozen, I should say. But, well, so far it could go up to 20. We're still thinking and seeing what we can do. But thank you, Sinead, out there.
5.3 then, the spring supplementary updates memorandum is at page 41 of our pack, so that's for members to note at this point, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. And then 5.4, there's correspondence from Lindsay Gibson, who's the UUP spokesperson for West Belfast, regarding ESF funding for job assist centres in Greater Shankill at page 46, which has been copied to members. Obviously, the ESF funding issue is one that we have dealt with considerably, and we're still awaiting correspondence from the Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Department for Levelling Up, following the informal meeting that we had with organisations a couple of weeks ago. So to note at this point, and we'll come back to all of the correspondence around that.
As soon as we get anything back, Chair, yes.
Okay. So moving on then to item number 6, which is levelling up. At last week's meeting, this was just being announced by the British Government, so we agreed to put it on the agenda. There is the UK-wide document, page 49, and the levelling up missions and metrics at page 75, and an executive summary at page 131. The specifics for the North can be found at page 61, which highlights the towns and cities across the North will see £617 million of investment through 4 city and growth deals. The Levelling Up Fund is investing £49 million in 11 projects as well. The other attached documents indicate priorities, however, there is little detail on process or engagement. Peter, it would be interesting to get a view, probably, and maybe it's the Finance Committee we have to write to on this, or the Finance Minister, you can advise on what is actually new money.
Well, I think that I was just going to say that, Chair, and also there's no reference. If you look through for some of the regions, it's setting out already where the Freeport will be. Now, I don't know if members remember, we had the department in a long time ago, and their view was to get as big a Freeport as they possibly could, possibly stretching from Belfast to North West. I'm not sure that was necessarily more than being kind of humorous, but there's no reference to it, and I just wondered what had happened, Chair, with that, in terms of whether we're getting it, or Chair, Mr.
Chair, May, I've had a briefing from Foyle Port, and there's an expectation rather than a certainty that we will get one. And I think they are working, they're working with Lauren from memory.
They are.
But then the question is, where does Belfast fit in? So it might be
They're
worth...
competing.
Sounds like it's that whole region Freeport thing again.
Yeah, it takes you back to that. Where else we go? We've got a point.
That's useful to maybe pursue.
The foil pitch is really interesting. They have a lot of land.
I remember there being some reference to that from officials at the time. It was just because it was referenced for other regions and there was nothing for here. I wondered.
Foil, because they've got land on beside the power station.
Yeah.
So they're talking about being a data processor because they've got all that energy. It's very interesting, and it might be worth asking them too.
So I recall there was a consultation on Freeport, so I assume what's in this is the outworking of that.
Chair, the reality is, in terms of this document, is there any new money in this? And it takes us back to this other issue of the loss of EU funds, the lack of local control and democratic control over the pot of money and how it's to be spent and distributed. These are not our decisions.
Chair, it might be worth, as you've indicated, writing to the Finance Minister to see if we can pin down what's going on. Because even though economy takes the lead in some of the aspects of this, such as cities, it's still the Finance Department that works out the funding package and lets everyone know what part they play and so on. They have that overarching lead. And obviously, we'll be copying that to the Finance Committee with the question of, are you potentially asking them if they're specifically going to look at this? They have that, maybe I think, bit of capacity to do that because I don't think they have any legislation at the minute. They do have legislation.
I think they're just finished.
They're just finishing, so they may have some capacity to start going into this more forensically. And I would have thought it was something that they may well want to do because they too have raised concerns around ESF and so on. So if members are content to write to the Finance Minister to see if he can identify whether there's new money, I'm assuming the city deals stuff is money that we're aware of but hasn't come yet. The other projects, some of them I'm sure I'd heard of. So it might just be worth pinning all that down.
And they actually refer to the New Decade, New Approach money as well.
Yes, there's a reference to that too. So if members are content, we try and ascertain that and ask Finance Committee if they're in a position to kind of drill down more into this with the remaining time left. Because we have outstanding correspondence, again, about the process and replacement of ESF, but they're maybe in more of a position to start doing things directly now.
Okay, so we will do our correspondence by correspondence if members are happy enough. So we'll move on then to item number 8, which is any other business. None has been indicated unless...
Sure.
That's great.
Thank you.
So then item number 9 is the date, time and place of our next meeting, which is Wednesday the 16th. We are back in room 30. And just to remind members, there's an informal meeting tomorrow morning via Teams at 11 a.m. with Hydrogen NI. So, okay.
Just on that, Chair, before we end, have any members been invited to Hydrogen Academy? I think it's
Is this by Northern Ireland Water?
I'm not 100% sure.
I have an invite to something to do with that.
The Minister did some PR at the Hydrogen Academy last week or the week before, and I just wondered if they had reached out more widely. Remember, it's a visit we would have wanted to do if we'd had kind of the ability and capacity, but I was just curious as to whether or not members had received any invitation. And now that I've said that live, you may expect more.
I think it's sort of one you would remember. I've never been invited to Hydrogen Academy before.
But it sounded very much kind of along with the discussions we'd had around renewables, so that's something we probably will be very, very interested in, probably next month. But it would have just been interesting if anyone could have reflected on having been there. Chair, that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly, Committee Room 29.